thank everyone for coming here today to Big River First Nation and welcome you to Big River First Nation. And I want to in particularly thank Chief Morin for hosting the premiers from across the nation here today to host Indigenous leaders, Chief Bellegarde, Gail Paul, as well as Chief Bertram here today. We had a great discussion with our national Indigenous organizations. We had a good discussion really focused on child and family services legislation here in the nation and how that intersects with what has been ultimately a service that has jointly been delivered by communities and provinces over the last period of time. How do we move forward and what are the next steps in moving forward, and really a focus on as we move forward to remain and keep focused on the children that this legislation is formed to ultimately protect. We had discussions around how can we engage as we move forward. How can we engage with communities across the nation, communities in our respective provincial areas, respective jurisdictions, understanding that there isn't a one-size-fits-all with that engagement process, understanding that we need to work hard as provincial leaders to engage with our not only our Aboriginal communities, but communities across the province as we ultimately remain focused on the well-being of the children, the well-being of our families that we ultimately represent. That led to a broader discussion as well on engagement in general and engagement with our First Nations communities in the general economy, our Canadian economy, understanding that there is one economy in this nation, that we are all engaged in one economy on this globe, really an international economy, and how can we work together to ensure that all of the communities in Canada, First Nation or otherwise, are engaging to the maximum degree in the economy. It led us back actually to a discussion about where we are today in Big River First Nation and the engagement that Chief Morin and the people living in this community have had over the course of the last decade in the forestry economy that is operating and is strong and vibrant in this area of the world, and how they're using the profits from the investments of this community in businesses that are operating in the forestry sector to really fund the investment in that next generation, to fund that investment in education for the people of Big River First Nations. And just in my closing introductory comments, I want to wholeheartedly thank you, Chief, for being such an excellent host. To wholeheartedly thank through you to each and every member of the community of Big River First Nation for hosting us here today. It was truly a historic day. The first time that premiers have had the opportunity to meet in a First Nations community, to meet with our engagement with our Indigenous organizations, and we thank you so very much for being a very important part of history today.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have a comment or two?
Yeah.
I just maybe wanted to say thank you to Premier Mo and all the premiers from Canada for being here, and for me to be able to co-host such a historic event means so much, not just to myself but to the community. To be able to showcase some of the things that we're doing in certain areas, and trying our best with what we have. And to me today was an eye-opener, being able to sit at a meeting of such important people of this great nation of ours, and just listening to the dialogue that they have, and realizing that a lot of the issues that we have in areas like our First Nations community are similar right across the country, and it was important for me to be able to hear that and listening to them and getting ideas, and I see a lot of hope, built on hope, and there's hope there that things are going to improve as we go along. And again, I just want to say thank you to Premier Mo, for seeing what we could bring to the table, and not just here but across Canada, like in sharing our experiences, the struggles that we have. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you to all the people in this community here for working so hard to make this a successful event. So I want to say thank you.
Right on. Yeah, sure. Just very quickly as well to acknowledge Chief Bruce Morin for his leadership in hosting the premiers, and Premier Mo for his initiative to bring it out here. And I mentioned earlier on that I wanted to be part of this because this has never happened before in Canada, where the premiers come out to a First Nations reserve. That was number one, why I wanted to be here. The other reason, of course, was to focus on the children And with Bill C-92 just recently being passed, federal legislation, I made the points that we dealt with the racism and discrimination for on-reserve services and programs for children through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision. That's one piece. But there's still 40,000 First Nations children in provincial and territorial foster care, and that needs to be addressed. And with the passing of C-92, there's a 12-month window now. And I encourage all the premiers to start work with First Nations leadership right across the territories, right across each province and territorial government, to work with First Nations leaders to outline and work with chiefs in respecting jurisdiction, to focusing more on prevention as opposed to apprehension, and that was the focus. And again, just being part of Chief Morin and the Driefer family, I had to be out here too, and I said that earlier on, and I really respect that Cree La Wakotwin, and I wanted to make sure I was part of that here. And there's a lot of other things we discussed, but we wanted to focus on the children, and this is always the first step. And I did point out there's a lot of work to do when we're trying to build a better province and a better territory or a better country together, because I always point out the gap that still exists. And according to the United Nations Human Development Index, Canada is rated 12 in terms of quality of life, but for First Nations people, we're 72. So it's 12 versus 72. So we really got to work together to close the gap and find greater investments in the economy and education and training and housing and healthcare. And by coming out to Big River today, it was also shown that provincial governments are investing on reserve as well for housing and education. And that makes good sense. Once you start to see that happening and breaking down that federal, provincial, territorial wall in terms of whether or not they should be investing on reserve as provincial governments. And so there was a lot of movement made in that sense. So I was really happy to be part of that from the AFN's perspective.
Good.
All right.
Mr. Belgar, when you decided to stop coming a couple of years ago, you had very specific concerns about how the premiers were dealing with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. Does your presence here signify that you think those have all been resolved satisfactorily, or is it because of those specific issues you mentioned?
Again, this is the pre-meeting, the official COFs tomorrow, and we're going to always keep trying to get at decision-making tables. And I've always said it, that more and more that when you have federal, provincial, territorial government tables, you need Indigenous people's voices at all those decision-making tables. And I'm going to keep pushing for that and encouraging that. You get better policy, you get better legislation, you get better dialogue, debate when you start respecting Aboriginal treaty rights and inherent rights. And having our voices at those tables, it's just value added. And this is the first step. This is the pre-COF meeting. We're going to always keep pushing to be at the full tables. And this is one process. At any upcoming federal, provincial table, whether it be on the economy, whether it be on the environment, whether it be on education, whether it be on climate change, I'm going to always keep pushing for First Nations voices to be there.
So will you be at the pre-meeting next year, or is this a one-off because of the specific nature of this location of this event?
Well, it depends who hosts it, and if it's out on First Nations territory, it would look pretty not very well for the AFN National Chief not to be out at Big River. So it depends where it's hosted next year.
I'll just make a comment on that as well. How appreciative I was, and I speak on behalf of the premiers as the chair of COF. How appreciative were of Chief Belgar's presence here today. It's valuable in the fact that he's able to provide us some insight with respect to the Child and Family Services conversation that we're having and how to engage on how we move forward in the different areas of the nation. Understanding we're very, very different. In Saskatchewan, we have a number of Child and Family Services agreements with our tribal councils across the province. They're working well, but there's much more room for improvement as we move forward in ensuring that we can continue to advocate and recruit foster families, for instance, in all of our communities, First Nations or otherwise, so that they are in place at the time when they may be required, for example. And so Chief Belgar's advice today on how to engage with communities in different areas of the world, because it's very different areas of our nation, because the situation is very different in the territories, very different than what we're dealing with here in Saskatchewan, very different in British Columbia and Atlantic Canada. And it was great insight, and we're very, very appreciative of his attendance here today.
National Chief, for the next 2 days, the premier's going to be talking a lot about energy projects specific to Trans Mountain. Some Indigenous groups are bitterly opposed. Some want to own the thing. How do you think they should be able to interpret that divide?
We had a general dialogue about energy and as well finding the balance between the environment and the economy. It is Canadians are divided, premiers are divided, chiefs are divided. I would encourage dialogue, discussion, debate, and let the rights and title holders determine that, the best next steps. My position has always been it's up to the rights and title holders. And it's also been create the space for dialogue. And when you involve First Nations people, whether you're talking about duty, consult, and accommodate, whether you're talking about free, prior, informed consent, whether you're talking about balancing the environment, the economy, when you have First Nations people at those tables, you find that good balance. And I think that's important because there's opportunity for equity ownership in the pipelines. There's opportunity to balance the environment, the economy, and I think you always find that sweet spot when you have the rights and title holders at the table, and that's the way you're gonna help resolve the issue. And it's very, very divisive. I think on a national, international stage, people just need to see the process and the plan to transition to clean energy. And I think that's the message going forward internationally. We're all too dependent on fossil fuels, we know that. But you can't turn the tap off tomorrow morning. We're all going to be flying home in airplanes and in helicopters and driving cars. You know, you need to balance the environment, the economy. But we need to see the plan to transition quicker to a clean energy. And as a society, we all need clean water to drink. We need clean air to breathe. We need clean soil so we can grow foods. So we're all part of that. And if we can incorporate our worldview as First Nations people into the federal, provincial, and private sector policy, how we respect Mother Earth, how we respect the grandmothers that look after the waters, we're all part of that. And I think when we're involved and bring our traditional elders' knowledge into that process, you're going to find better policy and legislation going forward.
And a number of premiers, including Premier Moe, have put forward this idea of energy corridors. They said they want to talk about it this weekend. Are you concerned about how energy corridors, the concept of it, might infringe with treaty rights?
Well, always, again, and we're going to always encourage the premiers and the prime ministers and CEOs to get First Nations people involved, get the rights and title holders involved, and you're going to get better policy and better legislation and better strategies if we're involved sooner than later. And build that respectful relationship first before you try to build anything.
Four
Premier
premiers
Moe,
aren't here, sir. What message does that send? 4 premiers didn't make the trip. What message does that send to you?
Again, it's people make choices every day. You go with what you have, and you build upon what you have. So next year will get better. Next year after that will get better. It's all about finding, again, the good common ground and bringing people together for dialogue and discussion. And education awareness leads to understanding, will lead to action. And we're going to always keep reaching out, keep building those relationships with the premiers and with the federal government and with all people. It's all about building a better country together. Nobody's going anywhere. So let's roll up our sleeves and really talk about reconciliation. Whether you're talking about education reconciliation, economic reconciliation, all the above. The gap's got to close. And once that gap closes, it's not only good for First Nations people. You're building a better province, territory, you're building a better country together.
Premier Moe, you talked about engagement with First Nations community. Can you provide did any specific decisions or policy changes come out of this conversation today on the family and child welfare piece?
No, what we did talk about is how we're so different across this nation and who to engage with in our respective areas. You know, when you look at Saskatchewan, we'd said we have 74 First Nations in this province. We have a number of tribal councils, and then we have the FSAN and ultimately the AFN. And there's all these different levels of engagement that we need to work very hard at in our province. Different in British Columbia, different in the Northwest Territories, different in various areas of the nation. So how do we engage, and not only when it comes to setting up and supporting our child and family services programs as we move forward, our supports for those families. How do we, at times when a child needs to leave their family, how do we put the supports in place so they don't actually hopefully have to leave their community? How do we, when we are trying to engage all of our communities, First Nations or otherwise, in the broader economy that we have in our provinces and our nation in the world, whether that be through the conversation around economic corridors, the development of our resources so that we can use that wealth to transition ultimately to a cleaner economy in Canada and share that innovation with others around the world. How do we engage with our Aboriginal communities in our respective jurisdictions to ensure that we can actually achieve what we all want, which is that broader engagement in the economy? Chief Morin has been a leader from this community in just that, in the broader the regional economy of forestry that we have here. He's used those profits to invest in that next generation, educating nurses and teachers with the ITEP program, partnerships with SIIT, the University of Saskatchewan, to give that next generation every opportunity to also participate in that economy. That is the goal for, I think, all of us here today, all of us in attendance.
National Chief, some social services ministers have talked about the difficulties of transitioning over when it comes to child welfare reform. So
we encourage all the premiers to begin that dialogue and process sooner than later with the respective First Nations in their territories, because it's all about jurisdiction. You know, when you read C-92, it talks about occupying the field and putting the needs of the child first, focusing on prevention as opposed to apprehension. And there's a 12-month time frame window. You know, if things don't change, the First Nations Child and Family Services Act will come into play, or you know, that jurisdiction will be respected. But it's all about working together. And I encourage the premiers to establish those tables, those working groups, and begin that dialogue to start talking about jurisdiction, but always putting the needs of the child first. And it's going to vary from province to province. You know, they're all at different levels, different capacities, and it's different. One size will not fit all. I just encourage them to begin that process sooner than later, because C-92 has been passed. It achieved royal assent, and we've got a lot of work to do. There's 40,000 children in care, and we know that's not acceptable. It's a human rights issue, and we need to fix that, and you can only do that by working together.
Did you get that commitment that they will begin those discussions?
I'm going to sense go out on a limb here and say there was a good nodding of heads around the table. That was one issue that the Premier said they want to work on together back in 2016, and I'm going to keep encouraging that. And next year we'll do our checkup, we'll do our timetable. But again, hopefully the numbers will come down, because that's what it's all about. And you only do that by communicating, collaborating, and working together. And I'm going to say there's a lot of nodding heads around the table today, but we will see.
In some
We have time
cases,
for one more question.
in some
after this.
cases that's already began. I talked a little bit of what has been happening in Saskatchewan, and I know there was
BC,
there's other conversations of the communications that have happened in other provincial and territorial jurisdictions. So the work is underway, and the goals are the same. And we, like Chief Bellegarde says, the closer we can work together as we move forward in keeping the focus on the well-being of the children and the families, most certainly is paramount.